Good morning, Litzy.
Good morning.
Okay, so just another reminder that you guys have a quiz over chapters 18 through 20. It is open. A good chunk of you guys have already taken it, so thank you for that. I've already got them graded. Also, thank you to those of you that turned in your reports early because I got all those graded. I just have to put them in, which means that I'll be able to grade the rest of them by the end of the day. So everyone should have their essay grades by the end of today, yes. Yeah, I know. Okay, thank you. I will regrade it, although you made an A on the first one, so. But yeah, I will regrade that, but it won't get any higher than that. Yeah, so thank you to those of you that did that. I don't think anyone that didn't submit theirs is here yet, so I don't have. But you only have that one final assignment, the quiz left. I would recommend go ahead and getting that out of the way as soon as possible so that you can focus on the final exam. Your final exam is next week. It will be online, so you can take it at your leisure as soon as it opens on Wednesday. So it'll be open on Wednesday and Thursday until midnight, and you can take it here, you can take it at home, it's whatever you prefer. Just a reminder that next week we are going to be doing a review as well over the content for the final exam. So make sure you come to class next week so that you can get that insider information on what's going to be on your test. Any questions about assignments? Okay. And we will go ahead and get started. So today's lesson is going to be particularly important for your short essays that are on your final. There are 2 short essay questions on your final exam, and the answers are in today's lesson. So I would recommend you pay close attention to today and take good notes. There's not too much writing on this section, but you will want to write down things that we covered. So first off, just a little brief review of yesterday. Yesterday, towards the end of the lesson, we started going over something called post-impressionism. Post-impressionism is just a word that refers to all of the trends in painting that followed the Impressionists post-1885. So it's just an overarching term that we use for all artwork following that. That particular term was coined by the art critic Roger Fry in England. That's not too particularly important, but I like to know word origins sometimes. In fact, starting yesterday, you might have noticed that a lot of the words that we're using to title art movements at this time are devised by critics. In fact, it started when we were going over the Rococo period with the idea of fait galant. And yesterday with Impressionism, that was a derogatory term coined by critics. Today we're going to continue that, and we're really going to begin to see the importance of art critics, although you kind of noticed it yesterday with realism and Impressionism, in determining what is going to be successful in the art world and what isn't, as well as giving these new trends in art their name. So the post-impressionist artists were groups of artists that felt impressionism didn't really leave any room for self-expression. Impressionism itself is just painting things as you see them immediately, so there really isn't any expression or self-expression going on there. And we noticed yesterday with expressionist painters like Van Gogh and Gauguin, that there are shifts and trends happening towards artists wanting to use the medium of painting as a form of self-expression. And like I said, those expressive movements are led by artists like Cézanne, Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Seurat. Just a refresher yesterday, Seurat is the artist that comes up with the idea of pointillism, which is using optical color theories to basically merge different polka dots of color into creating one singular color. And of course, Cézanne, who will eventually today be known as the predecessor to Cubism. We are going to be talking about Cubism today, but he used large swashes of color and very loose brush strokes in order to paint this town and mountain in his backyard. And of course, Van Gogh, who is very influenced by both Impressionism and Japanese prints, and Gauguin, who is also very influenced by Japanese prints. Today, we're going to be talking about these particular movements. So we're going to be going over Fauvism, Expressionism, Cubism, Synthetic Cubism, and Futurism, as well as a couple of others. So these are just the titles, and as we go through the lesson today, we'll be figuring out what these things actually are and their characteristics. Starting with the Fauves. The Fauves are kind of influenced by artists like Van Gogh and Gauguin. If you remember yesterday with Gauguin's Water, I mentioned that Gauguin likes to use very odd color choices to express images. The Fauves take note of Van Gogh and Gauguin and what they're working on and decide to also use very bright, unusual colors to express images. So, for example, making trees purple. They were called Les Fauves by critics. Les Fauves translates into English as wild beasts because the critics felt that these artists were not following any rules and using garish, ugly colors in order to illustrate things. A lot of their art also has a bit of a childlike quality in the fact that it is extremely flat. And last I checked, children are not the best at choosing colors. For example, painting kitty cats green when they're younger. So there is quite a bit of a childlike quality with their works, particularly with Henri Matisse, who is the leader of the Fauves. Henri Matisse is a no, I'm thinking of someone else. Never mind. The Fauves only exhibited for a couple of years, from 1905 to 1907, and they were very heavily inspired by the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, who was a philosopher at the time. In fact, a good chunk of the art movements that we're going to be talking about are very much inspired by different philosophy trends that are popping up. I said, Henri Matisse was the leader of the Fauves. This was quite a bit after the Fauves exhibited in 1948, actually a long time after. But post the Fauve art, Matisse continued using very bright colors to illustrate ideas and using very flat, two-dimensional painting styles. You can see just how flat that is with the table here. The table looks like it's slanted upward. It has no depth or dimension to it. Here you can't really tell if that's a painting or a window. It is a window, and it has a very childlike quality to it. Here is Henri Matisse's masterpiece. This was painted right around the time that the Fauves were exhibiting. This is The Joy of Life. It took him 2 years to paint, despite how flat it looks and simple it looks. But here we see illustrated different pleasures in life, such as music, romance, some music again, art. This is supposed to be symbolic of a statue, and then dancing. So also the muses are represented. This also has a bit of mythology to it, with the little boy playing the flute and the goats nearby. If you're familiar with the those little goat men that I can't remember their names today. Anyone remember? Well, you guys know what I'm talking about. I can't remember their names. So we see the different pleasures in life illustrated, and of course the quintessential Fauvist marking, which is very odd color choices. So for example, the green tree with the yellow and orange leaves, the yellow person, the pink people, the grass being blue and green and yellow, and then of course the sky being pink in the background. It's also extremely flat. It has almost a watercolor-like tendency to it, but it is in fact oil paints. However, he has thinned them out quite a bit with a lot of turpentine. And of course, our other member of the Fauve group is André Derain. André Derain, a British artist that is known for doing very impressionist-like paintings, but using very odd color choices to accomplish that. So the impressionist-like qualities you can really see down in this bottom area with the thick swatches of blue and yellow. There's also a bit of pointillism happening here, with the blue and yellow eventually mixing to make green. And of course, the odd color choices are exhibited in the skyline being red, the buildings being blue, the bridge being yellow, and the water being green. If you're wondering what the view from London Bridge actually looks like, the sky is usually a bit of a gray color. The buildings around there are mostly done in concrete and marble. The bridge itself is done in concrete, and the water is not that green. It's not blue, but it's not that green. So eventually the Fauves will contribute to the culmination of a period of German Expressionism, meaning that these couple of groups of German Expressionist artists that we're about to talk about were very heavily influenced by the Fauves, particularly the Fauves' color choices and the way they used color in order to express themselves. Expressionism, like we talked about yesterday, is an art style which emphasizes inner thoughts and inner feelings over the depiction of realistic objects. Most of these artists came from Germany and were influenced by other artists such as Van Gogh, Gauguin, and Munch, which were the three artists that we talked about yesterday that fell under the Expressionist category. There are two German Expressionist groups that come out of this period of time, and those two groups are the Bridge or Die Brücke and the Blue Rider group or Der Blue Rider. So once again, we're talking about German Expressionism for the time being. One such member of German Expressionism, she wasn't a member of the Bridge group or the Blue Rider, those were only comprised of men, but she was also a German artist that was using painting as a medium of expression, and that is Paula Modersohn-Becker. Paula Modersohn-Becker did go to art school. At this point in time, women are being accepted into art school. Their rules aren't quite as strict as they were in the 1800s. When we get to the early 1900s, there's still quite a few rules that apply to women that don't apply to men, but not near as many as there were. Once again, she is working in Germany. Paula Modersohn-Becker used art as a way to express her moods at that point in time. And we know that because she kept a very detailed diary and journal of what she felt every single day of her life. But she, throughout her lifetime, struggled with fertility. She and her husband tried to get pregnant several times. It's around the time that she paints Self-Portrait with an Amber Necklace that she is finally pregnant. So this painting is a self-portrait that symbolizes how she felt when she learned that she was finally pregnant with a child. So there's joy, there is celebration of the body there, and she's using painting to express those feelings. Unfortunately, later on, she ended up having a miscarriage and was never able to have children. And of course, she does paintings to reflect that as well, but they aren't quite as popular as this one. Now, our first German Expressionist group, this was a group of artists that worked together and exhibited together, is the Bridge or Die Brücke group. This group was led by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. All of the members were architects at one point in time, and they decided to switch to painting. Every single one of them was architects. The main purpose of the Bridge group and their goal was to create a bridge themselves. They were going to be the bridge between Germany's past and the modern present. So a quote there from Kirchner is a link between the present epoch and their creative future. So what I mean by Germany's past has to do with the architecture. Remember, every single one of these guys is an architect, so they're very influenced by architecture. Anyone have any guesses as to what architecture was probably most prominent in Germany? We've talked about it before. Would it have been Romanesque, Classical, Gothic? What do you think was probably most prominent in Germany? Gothic, yes. So Germany is very well known for their large amount and abundance of Gothic architecture. Almost every single German city will have some form of Gothic architecture on display. So these architects grew up seeing that past, and they're trying to create a bridge between Germany's Gothic era of architecture and the modern era of painting, which was exhibited by artists like the Fauves. So basically making Gothic art look more modern. And of course, the leader, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, this is his attempt at trying to be that bridge between the past and the present with Street Berlin. So here we see echoes of German Gothic architecture with the long pointed figures. You see a little bit of a reminiscence of some Gothic arches in the way that he has chosen to set up his composition. Also some echoes of stained glass windows. If you remember, it is the Gothic era that produces stained glass for the first, primarily used for churches to bring in heaven's light. But here he has used it in the colors of paint. But we can also see how this painting is extremely modern with the way that he has chosen to use those colors and use the forms and shapes of the people. This is not a realistic interpretation of a street. This is a bit more of an abstract interpretation of people walking along the street, which makes it quite a bit better. So once again, this merges the past Gothic era with the present. Of course, not present for us, present for them. And that takes us to our second German expressionist group, which is Der Blue Rider, or the Blue Rider. They were a group of artists that called themselves the Blue Riders. They worked together. It was comprised of Russians and Germans working in Germany. And they were led by Vasily Kandinsky, who was a Russian artist who had immigrated to Germany. Unfortunately, they did not last very long because of World War I. So they lasted from 1911 to 1914. A good chunk of the members ended up having to go fight in World War I. They were conscripted into the army, and several of them died. But they're very fundamental in the expressionist movement and getting it on its way and making it what it is today. So Vasily Kandinsky was the leader, and he worked closely with another member named Franz Marc. In fact, Franz Marc and Vasily Kandinsky were the two main culprits in coming up with the name the Blue Rider Group, mostly because both of them really loved the color blue as their favorite color. And Marc liked horsemen, and Kandinsky liked horsemen and riders and horses as well. So they found some commonality in the color blue and horsemen, and therefore came up with the name the Blue Rider. And a lovely little fun thing about the Blue Rider group is a majority of the art produced by them while they were working together contained the color blue and a horse or a horse and rider. Unfortunately, Franz Marc is one of the members that passes away in World War I. So we don't have too many artworks from him, but we do have a few, and they all pretty much look the same. So Vasily Kandinsky was not fighting in World War I, so he does go on to mature as an artist, and eventually he will shift from creating more Fauve-like works with images that you can understand to very abstract artworks. And of course, here is the cover of their almanac. They would release an almanac every year they were working together, designed by one of the artists that were a member. And of course, there's your Blue Rider. Here's an early work by Vasily Kandinsky. That should not say 1090, that should say 1990. But here you see, you can depict what is what in this image. So you can see the horses with the riders, the blue mountain in the background, the trees, and the skyline. Eventually, Kandinsky will lose all realism in his art. And like I said, it will go completely abstract. But here we see strong impressions of the Fauve artists. The Fauves, once again, were using those very strange color choices and very flat depictions of images. Once again, we see the use of odd, interesting color choices and flatness. Eventually, like I said, Kandinsky will start making things extremely abstract. And completely veer away from any realistic sense of depicting things. That's because Kandinsky believes that he can portray music as he's listening to it. We've talked about him before. He would listen to these musical scores and try to paint what he heard. Of course, music doesn't have an image. So this is very non-representational abstract art versus representational. And of course, he titled his artworks based off of what particular score he was listening to at that time. Of course, vaguely, because you wouldn't know what composition 4 is without the actual piece's title. And eventually, it will get even more abstract as time goes on. The other member of the group, besides the ones that we aren't going to mention today, is Franz Marc. Franz Marc is the pal that worked with Kandinsky to come up with the name of the Blue Rider group. And Franz Marc is most well known for painting really large blue horses. Like I said, he was killed during World War I, so we don't have too many works from him, but that also makes his works extremely coveted and collected. And a wonderful example of the Blue Rider group. You have large blue horses. And you can also see in Franz Marc's works the inspiration of the Fauves and their interesting color choices. That takes us to Cubism. Cubism is an art form that was created by George Braque and Pablo Picasso. Most of the time, beginning art historians that are just taking their first art class mostly think that it's Picasso that comes up with it by himself, but he's actually working, like they're sitting down together and talking and discussing this with George Braque in Spain. And eventually the two of them moved to Paris together, and they remain close friends throughout their life. Picasso will eventually move on from Cubism and go through his rose and blue periods. Braque sticks with Cubism, but they're working together to invent this new art form, and they're looking at Cézanne to come up with their ideas. In fact, they were so heavily influenced by Cézanne that they went to his hometown where the Mount Saint Victoire was located and painted in the same locations to see what they could come up with and see how closely they could paint like Cézanne and how much they could evolve past Cézanne. They were also very influenced by African sculpture. It's at this point in history that we start seeing museums in Europe that are exhibiting artworks and artifacts from the rest of the world. So artifacts from Africa and from a lot of ancient people groups are being shown off in places like Britain and Paris and Spain that these artists are able to go see and they're gaining inspiration from. Cubism itself starts off pretty basic, but it does eventually get very complex. which we will see happen. So just a refresher of what Paul Cézanne is doing. He's creating these very cube-like buildings and structures. And George Braque and Picasso are copying that idea. So here we see houses on a mountainside, similarly to here with Cézanne. But they have chosen to depict the house structures as very basic geometric shapes. Eventually, Cubism will lose all sense of color and all sense of reality. They'll start using monochromatic colors in order to paint. So that means no real colors, just your blacks and grays and browns. And that is what true Cubism will eventually get to. But before that, the artists Braque and Picasso are still working on developing those ideas. So this particular painting, as well as this one, are in the early stages of Cubism. Here is Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. And this particular example of Cubism I like to pull up because you can really tell the African inspiration in the faces. So he was going to the museums and sketching out these African masks, and eventually he took those sketches back to his studio and used them in this composition. This particular painting was not well received by critics. In fact, a good chunk of any of the artworks that we've been talking about so far weren't really well received by critics. But this particular one made them very upset because it is a painting of prostitutes, and it kind of glorifies the prostitutes, and the critics and people as a whole didn't like that the prostitutes were being exhibited in a very large, prominent format, and they aren't being shameful at all. But once again, Cubism uses extremely geometric shapes in order to illustrate things. Eventually, oh, here's one of the African masks that Picasso was inspired by, which once again, you can see in the faces. That's going to be important for your test next week. There's a little fun fact there. Might want to put an asterisk next to that, I don't know. But eventually Cubism will become very advanced and monochromatic, like I said. So true Cubism takes an object like this Kleenex box, and it breaks down the object by trying to show every single side and angle of this Kleenex box at once. So if you've ever, like when you were in elementary school, had a piece of paper with like the squares on it and you had to make a cube, that's what Cubism is. It's before you make the cube. It's all of the sides broken down at the same time. So here we see an illustration of a Portuguese man with a guitar sitting at a cafe. Yes, you can see all of those things in there, but it's showing him from every angle possible all at once. You can kind of make out his eye and nose here and his mustache. Here's parts of his guitar. And if you look really close, you can see a bit of the cafe table in the background as well. Of course, you also see some newspaper print in the background. And of course, Picasso and Braque, they started doing this around the same time. This is 1911, and they continued on with this for a few years. Braque continues on with this for the rest of his career. Picasso will eventually move past it. But here is Majoli, another cafe setting with a guitar. Here's a bit of the guitar over here. Here's a newspaper and some music that was sitting on the cafe table. Very hard to read and interpret real Cubism. It's not as simple as it started off, is it? It's very complex. So that particular form of cubism that we just looked at with the monochromatic colors and very hard to read is called analytical cubism. So these two right here, that's analytical cubism. Eventually Picasso will move on past that and create something called synthetic cubism. Synthetic cubism is using a combination of mediums, so they are mixed media pieces. Sometimes they're collages, sometimes they're small sculptures, but it uses a variety of mediums besides just painting in order to illustrate cubism. And synthetic cubism is a lot easier to read than analytical cubism. So we go back to using recognizable shapes and colors and making images not quite as complex to read. And of course, here is one example of synthetic cubism. We'll look at a three-dimensional example in a moment, but here you can see this is a mixed media piece which illustrates a violin, fruit, and wine glass from 1913. So not too long after analytical cubism, Picasso already moved past it. And here you can see the violin. We're still illustrating things from multiple viewpoints. So the violin has been broken down. Same with the pears. But here we see a collage of different pieces of paper that have been drawn on and painted on. And of course, like I said, he will also eventually move into doing three-dimensional pieces in a synthetic cubist manner. So here we see a guitar made out of basically cardboard and construction paper with some metal and wire. But we're still showing the guitar from multiple viewpoints. But you can definitely tell it's guitar. Of course, Picasso will eventually move past synthetic cubism, and like I said, he'll go on to his Rose period and his Blue period. That's just symbolic of the particular color palettes that he was using at the time. For the Rose period, he was using a lot of reds and peaches and pinks, and for the Blue period, a lot of shades of blue. And supposedly it was a bit of a nod to his mentality at the time as well. But we're going to look at a little bit more sculptures, well, a few more sculptures, but they don't fall under Cubism, yay, but they are abstract. And the main sculpture that we're going to be looking at for the early 1900s time period that we're on at the moment is Constantine Brancusi. Constantine Brancusi is a student of Auguste Rodin. We talked about Rodin yesterday. So Rodin taught him. And like Rodin, he was originally very much influenced by Michelangelo's slave pieces, his unfinished pieces, which you can definitely see here with Sleep. But Brancusi will move past what Rodin was doing and what Michelangelo's unfinished pieces were, and eventually start creating some very abstract artworks. Here you can see he has moved past it just a year later with Sleeping Muse 1, which is quite a bit more pared down from his original Sleep. And this is also very influenced by these figures. Once again, museums were starting to exhibit artifacts from other cultures and ancient people groups. This is a Cycladic figure from the Cycladic islands in Greece. We didn't get to talk about this because it was from the Greek Dark Ages, but if you want to learn about the Cycladic people, you can take the art history class next semester. Here you can see the influence with that. And of course, eventually he goes extremely abstract with Newborn 1. This doesn't quite look like a human newborn, but what does it look like? Huh? I heard two people. Yeah, it looks like an egg or a boiled egg. So a newborn, but not in the sense of a human one, a newborn in the sense of a chicken egg. Of course, very abstract version of a newborn or a way to depict a newborn. And he continues on with his abstraction throughout the early 1900s. This is Bird in Space, made in 1928. He is also starting to experiment with using different mediums besides marble. Here he's used bronze. But in order to understand what he's trying to show here, you have to know what's happening in this point in history in 1928 and why this might be called Bird in Space. So any guesses as to what this is supposed to represent? Well, first glance, what does it look like? It looks like a feather, so it looks like it might be a feather. Ethan, what were you going to say? Okay. Kind of, but this is before the rocket. What's happening in 1928 that has to do with flight? Anyone online know what happens in 1920s, in the early 1900s with flying things? Don't be the only class I've ever taught that doesn't know. Yes, the Wright brothers finally invented flight and airplanes in the early 1900s. So Brancusi is not just representing birds with a feather-like format, but he's also representing a plane propeller, which is what we see here. So we have airplanes with propellers happening in the 1920s. Actually, flight has happened way past that. In World War I, people were already using planes for fighting, so way past that. But yes, there's two depictions of flight here. There's the literal feather, and then there's also the more abstract plane propeller. Now, meanwhile, in America, we've been talking about Europe for a while now. Let's check in with America and see what's happening there. The main contemporary artist at this point in time in America is Alfred Stieglitz and his wife, Georgia O'Keeffe. Luckily, in his New York gallery, 291, that was the name of the gallery, he is showing more contemporary artists. Contemporary art, however, was not well received in the United States at all. We wanted to keep doing landscape paintings and landscape photography. We did not want to go contemporary. But Alfred Stieglitz was introducing the artists Cezanne, Matisse, Brancusi, Picasso, and Braque to American public through his gallery, as well as through his magazine called Camera Works. But of course, you're only hitting a fairly small audience when you're doing that. Just a refresher on who Alfred Stieglitz was. He was the photographer that did the steerage photograph that we see here, which helps to illustrate the social divisions in the United States at that point in time between wealthy and lower class by actually using the ship. And here's the works of his wife, Georgia O'Keeffe. She was doing more abstract paintings. They were not entirely well received. She did become more popular than her husband, but not for these works. She became more popular thanks to her flower paintings, in which she paints very large close-up images of flowers. Eventually, Georgia O'Keeffe will divorce Alfred Stieglitz and move to New Mexico, which is kind of what she's painting here. She's actually painting an image from Lubbock, Texas, the sunset. But she's more well known for these early images of more organic drawings. And meanwhile, our architecture is mostly designed by the Chicago style artists, large square box buildings, and artists like Frank Lloyd Wright, who are creating prairie house style and using cantilevered roofs, if you remember back to our architectural section. So that's what's happening in America. Quite a bit different than our European counterparts. Eventually, though, Alfred Stieglitz arranges something called the Armory Show in 1913. The Armory Show only travels to Chicago and New York, and it is a show entirely comprised of European contemporary artists and their artworks. It ends up getting 300,000 visitors, which at that point in time is quite a bit. And it helps to really push American art forward a bit in time. And that is because a lot of artists visited this show and were inspired by what was happening in Europe. You got to remember, this is a point in history where there's no internet, no cell phones, nothing. The only way that you can see what's happening overseas is if you actually buy magazines or go to these art shows or things like that to see what these artists are making. Which is one of the reasons why there is such a big difference between American art and European art at this point in history. So we'll come back to the Armory Show at the very end of today's lesson because there's one particular artwork and artist that was showcased at the Armory Show that's going to end up being featured in the newspapers quite prominently. And he's going to end up inspiring a lot of people. So we'll come back to that. But before we do that, we're going to take a quick side trip to Italy. In Italy at this point in time, Futurism is the main art trend. Futurism is heavily influenced by Cubism, so we're looking at artists that were inspired by Braque and Picasso. But Cubism, when we think back to it, were any of those images that we looked at for Cubism images of moving objects? No, they were all stagnant. They were all sitting still. Futurism is interested in moving. So they're going to use the same concepts of Cubism by showing objects from multiple sides at the same time, but use it to illustrate moving objects, which that'll make more sense in a second when we look at our dog picture. So this is once again an Italian group. They're very influenced by the machine, particularly trains, planes, and automobiles. So anything with a lot of speed and movement and motion is what they like to paint. They did have a manifesto. Does anyone know what a manifesto is? Anyone online know what a manifesto is?
I do not.
Okay, well, that's going to be really important when we get to communism in a second. So most usually manifestos are associated with communism, but manifestos have existed for a very long period of time. What it is a guideline of rules and goals in which a group is trying to meet. So they sit down together as a group and come up with goals and rules to follow. So that's all a manifesto is. Manifestos, like I said, are most commonly associated with communism because there is something called the Communist Manifesto, and that's probably the most well-known manifesto out there, but they've existed for a long period of time. It's literally just outlining goals, but it does get a bad rep. So here is our first example of Futurism by Giacomo Balla. This is Abstract Speed. The car has passed. If you've ever been in a car and looks out the window, which I'm sure everyone probably has, you'll notice that the scenery goes by pretty rapidly. That is what he's trying to depict here, is the scenery moving past very rapidly. Of course, rapidly for us is like 90 miles per hour. Rapidly for him was 30. That's as fast as the car would go back then, was 30 miles per hour. And that was really, really fast to him. And he was amazed by how fast the car could go. And he wanted to illustrate how fast and quickly the scenery was passing by him. That's exactly what he did. So once again, very interested in depicting motion, movement, and interested with new technologies and speed. And here you can really see how I meant they're influenced by Cubism. So the Cubists are trying to show objects from different viewpoints at the same time. These guys are doing that just with motion. So here we see the dog's tail was wagging, and they've decided to illustrate the movement of wagging by making a bunch of different dog tails. Same with the feet and the leash and the woman's skirt. They showed movement by replicating the same image multiple times over top of each other. This is another Giacomo Balla, dynamisms of a dog on a leash. And of course, the quintessential Futurism piece here is Umberto Boccioni, Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. For this particular sculpture, of which there are many, many, many copies, Boccioni decided that he wanted to try to illustrate a man walking towards the future. So we see here movement being illustrated in the man walking, and he looks like a very futuristic man, which is what he's trying to illustrate, a man walking towards the future. I mean, they're called the Futurists for a reason. They're interested in the future and new technologies that are going to come about. And other art that includes movement that is not futurist, because there are more, we see Marcel Duchamp. This is the one that I was talking about that was showcased in the Armory Show. So in 1913, the Armory Show showcased a lot of contemporary artists. One such artist was Marcel Duchamp, and the particular artwork that was shown was Nude Descending a Staircase #2. For this painting, Marcel Duchamp used a new invention called stroboscopic photography. That's going to be on your final. You should probably jot that down. Stroboscopic photography. What that is you set up a camera, and once you click start, it takes continuous images. So he set up a camera with a woman at the top of a staircase. And then as the woman began to walk down, he set off the timer, and it took multiple images while she was walking down the staircase until she got to the bottom. Then he overlaid those photographs before they were fully developed, while they were still in the transparent form. He overlaid them, and this is what he got, was the different images of the woman laid over top of each other. So for this particular painting, this is literally an image of the same woman walking down a staircase, just overlaid on top of each other. He just copied the photograph and made it a little bit more abstract. So very influenced by Cubism, but also interested with showing movement in paintings. This particular painting was not well received in America. In fact, the US president at the time said it looked like a shingle factory exploded. Wish I can see that. But it ends up inspiring quite a few different American artists, and Marcel Duchamp becomes quite well known across the world thanks to the bad publicity that he receives. Marcel Duchamp is going to be one of our main stars of tomorrow's lesson, because he's also a member of the Dada movement, which is the first thing we're talking about tomorrow. Dada artists are fun. But our last thing that we're going to talk about today that showcases movement is Sonia Delaunay-Turc, La Balle Bouillère. Sonia Delaunay-Turc was a fashion designer at the time, well, most well known for her fashion. She made affordable fashion using a lot of patchwork quilting style. And you can kind of see the patchwork quality here with her painting. This is an oil painting on mattress ticking. Mattress ticking is a fabric as well, so not a normal medium for someone to want to paint on. Normally it'd be canvas or wood, but she's chosen mattress ticking. But here we see illustrated different couples dancing around on the ballroom floor. You can make out the men in their tuxedos holding the women. I taught this one semester and then you thought they were penguins, which was cute. They kind of look like penguins. But today we have gone over German Expressionism and the German Expressionist groups, the De Broek or the Bridge and the Blue Rider. Those two are going to be really important for you. We also went over the Fauves and their wild uses of color. You can still see influence from the Fauves here. And then we went over Cubism. Cubism obviously heavily influential in later on art styles, and we're going to see influence from them tomorrow as well. And of course, the Futurists that are interested in showcasing movement and new technologies. Tomorrow, we are going to start off with the period of time following World War I and into World War II. We're going to be talking about art between the wars. And then, of course, we will end off with art made post-World War II and art made today. Those will be our final lessons. But that is it for today. If any of you did not turn in your paper, you need to stick around. If you did turn in your paper, like I said at the beginning, I will get those graded today and up for you guys to see. Some of them I have posted, but that's just because I got into work early today and I figured I might as well do something. But other than that, I will see everyone tomorrow. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And I look forward to seeing you all, and we will have a wonderful lesson. But like I said, if you didn't turn in your paper, you need to stick around and talk to me. Okay? Bye, guys.